Hello and welcome to Chapter 4 Notes. And so in this chapter we're going to talk about we'll review some cost estimation methods, and then we will talk about cost estimation techniques, and then we'll go into cost volume profit analysis, and then talk about break-even analysis and target profit analysis, and also talk about break-even analysis with multiple products as well. So there's a lot going on in this chapter, okay? So let's go ahead and start off our discussion by reviewing variable cost and fixed cost behavior. So what I have over here is I just have a little graph that says dollars and then activity. So remember what we have is if we have a cost that's totally variable, it's going to look like that, right? That it will increase, the total variable cost will increase as activity goes up, okay? So if you think about that, again, an example of a variable cost would be the waiter and waitress salaries at a restaurant, for example, where if we have more waiters and waitresses on staff for that night, our labor costs will go up simply because we have to pay more hours. But that does not change how much we pay them per hour. So that stays the same, but the total labor cost will go up because the number of hours goes up. So getting back to what I was saying earlier, we assume that variable costs per unit stay the same. It's supposed to be a straight line. It's a little bit wavy there, but it's a straight line. So variable costs per unit stay the same. Total variable costs increase as activity increases. The variable cost per unit stays the same as activity increases. Total fixed costs, on the other hand, think about rent on a restaurant. If we have one customer or 100 customers, we still pay the same amount of rent. But if we want to calculate rent per customer, as we have more customers, the rent per customer drops. Okay? So it's just a quick review there of variable and fixed costs. Let's just talk about two different types of fixed costs over here. We can say committed fixed costs versus discretionary fixed costs. So we can say with committed fixed costs, they're more long-term, hard to reduce, okay, without penalty. Okay? So we could say, we could say salaries. Salaries could be tough to reduce. I could say salaries, and I could be more specific. I could say salaries of a tenured professor, for example, because it's very difficult to get to basically lay off a tenured professor. Very difficult. So what ends up happening on the part of the university when they grant tenure is it becomes a committed fixed cost. We could say a mortgage, right? You can get out of your mortgage, right? But you could suffer a penalty, right? You may lose money on your house. You will certainly have to pay realtor's fees and other closing costs. And so mortgage is a committed fixed cost. You could even say a car payment. It's going to be tougher to get out of with a car payment, okay? With the discretionary fixed costs, we can say they usually arise from annual decisions. So easier to reduce, not as long-term, okay? So some examples here, if you want to think about your own personal budget, you could think of maybe cable. Yeah, if you get out of your cable contract earlier with Verizon Fios, I'll pick on Verizon Fios, that's who I have, I'll have to pay a fee, but it's not going to be a huge fee. It might be $50 or $100 or something like that. It's not going to be the end of the world. Trying to get out of the mortgage, though, selling your house is a big ordeal. So it's a lot harder. These are stickier costs. These costs are less sticky. You want to think of it that way. But discretionary costs we can reduce easier than we can reduce committed fixed costs. Okay. I guess just I'll editorialize here a little bit with regard to my personal budget. I'm always leery of this. I just spend a lot of time over here. If I'm going to buy a new car, I know that's a big committed fixed cost. And so those kind of commitments are difficult to get out of. They're difficult to reduce those costs without some type of a penalty. So I'm very cautious about entering in agreements that increase my committed fixed costs. Let's talk about mixed costs. Remember, we had variable costs and we had fixed costs, and now we can talk about mixed costs. So mixed costs contain both a variable and fixed component. So an example of a mixed cost would be utilities. So if you think about utilities on Woodard Hall, which is where we hold our business school, if there's nobody in the business school, we still have utilities. We still have to pay to heat it or pay to cool it. But once all the students and faculty start coming into Woodard Hall, what happens to utilities costs once we start turning on the lights and turning on the projectors, turning on laptops? Utilities costs start to go up. So utilities is a really good example of a mixed cost. Another example would be manufacturing overhead. Manufacturing overhead does contain some variable components, which would be indirect materials, but also contains some fixed components. We could say rent on the factory would be a fixed component. So manufacturing overhead is an example of a mixed cost. One more example of a mixed cost would be compensation for salespersons. Salespeople are typically paid in a combination of commissions and salary. The salary would be fixed, the commissions would be variable. Okay? So when we think about this, we can draw a little diagram here to show our fixed costs. We can say over here, we can say A, B, and C, and what I can say is over there, this is total variable cost. Okay? This is our total fixed cost. Right? From B to C would be our fixed cost, A to B would be our variable cost. And then the slope over here equals our variable cost per unit. Okay? And so if you think back to some of the stuff that you did back in high school where you had to calculate, you had to deal with linear equations, remember this formula, y equals a plus bx. So what I'm trying to say over here with this formula is that we can use this formula to predict mixed cost at any level of activity. We can predict our total mixed cost at any level of activity if we know the total fixed cost and we know the slope, which is the variable cost per unit. Okay? So basically we can take our fixed cost plus our variable cost per unit times the level of activity, and then that would give us our total mixed cost right there. Okay? That's what I'm showing with this little equation. So I do have a problem for you to do. You might just want to pause the video and give this problem a try and then check your work. But I'm going to go ahead and go over it now. It says right over here, if your fixed monthly utility charge is $40, your variable cost is 30 cents per kilowatt hour, and your monthly is, you have 2,000 kilowatt hours, what's your total utility bill? So we can just come over here, y equals a plus bx. We say our $40 plus our 0.3, which is our variable cost per kilowatt hour, times the 2,000 kilowatt hours, $640 would be our total utilities cost. Okay? What I'm saying over here is that with step costs, a resource could be attainable only in large chunks, such as maintenance workers, and whose costs increase or decrease only in response to fairly wide changes in activity. Another step cost that I would think about is rent. If you think about rent on a restaurant, maybe what they have is, from 0 to 100 customers, they say, well, we're just going to need one restaurant. Okay? But what happens when they start hitting capacity all the time? They might actually want to open another restaurant. So then what's going to happen in that situation is they open restaurant 2. So this is restaurant 1. This becomes restaurant 2. And that goes from 100 to 200 customers. Well, what happens to the total rent cost? It stays constant here, and then it moves up when they open up a second restaurant. Okay? So what you can see is it's moving in a step fashion. So if you think about it, really what you could say is in the long run, all costs become variable. Okay? when you think about the long run, all costs become variable. Okay? Because they didn't have to open up that restaurant. And once they do, they incur another fixed cost. When we talk about the context of the activity base, we can say for a cost to be variable, okay, it must increase or decrease with respect to the activity base, whatever that activity base is. Okay? And it will stay constant per unit. So it's going to increase or decrease in total, with respect to the activity base, whatever that activity base is. So you could say examples that we've done are units produced. Okay? But if you think about it, maybe if you take an internal IT help desk, it would be a good activity base for an internal IT help desk. But each time I call the help desk, I always get a help desk ticket. So it seems to me the number of help desk tickets would be a good activity base for the help desk. And it's also the cost driver. So the more help desk tickets this help desk has, the more people that they have to employ. And so that's going to be driving their costs. And so the costs of a help desk are going to vary with respect to the variable cost. The variable cost will vary with respect to the number of help desk tickets. Okay? So it doesn't always have to be units produced or units sold would be another one. Okay? It could be help desk tickets for a help desk. And of course, finally, we have over here, we have a linearity assumption is that our slope remains constant. So we say our variable cost per unit stays the same. So we're assuming a linear relationship, which means the variable cost per unit stays the same, which we've talked about quite a few times. So we say over here, talking about classifying a cost as variable or fixed, we do have a couple things that could influence our decision. You could say the choice of the cost object. The cost object, by definition, is the department, product, or service that receives the cost. Okay, it can be variable, so we could have a cost that's going to be variable with respect to one cost object, but then in another situation it would be fixed. So, for example, what we could say is that if we have a registration cost for vehicles, a registration cost could be with respect could be a registration cost could be variable with respect to the total number of vehicles, but for a particular vehicle, the registration cost would be fixed with respect to the number of miles driven. So it doesn't matter how many miles you drive, you still paid the same cost to register the vehicle. But the more vehicles you have, the higher the total registration cost. So it depends upon fixed variable with respect to what. In this case, it's fixed with respect to the number of miles driven by that particular vehicle, but it'd be variable with respect to the total number of vehicles that you have. We say over here, another example would be the time horizon. What we could say would be if a flight is getting ready to take off, most of the costs at that point are fixed. But in the long run, they're variable because that flight, the airline did not have to go on that route during that particular date and time. So they didn't have to. So in the long run, it'd be a variable cost. But as you get ready for that flight to take off, most of the costs on that plane become a fixed cost. Okay? Then we say over here, the last thing is, this is more of a concept that you just need to understand, is the relevant range. You can say over here with the relevant range, we assume that our assumptions about variable costs remaining constant per unit and total fixed costs remaining constant in total stay true. Okay? So why don't you go ahead and tackle this quick check problem, and we'll see. Okay, you may want to pause the video and give it a try. So which of the following statements are true? Fixed costs per unit vary. That's true. They do vary per unit, but in total they stay the same. Variable costs per unit are constant. That's also true. Total fixed costs are constant within the relevant range. That's also true. And then the last one, total variable costs are constant. No, they will increase or decrease with the level of activity. Okay? Thank you. The next one, we'll start to go over cost estimation methods. Thanks.